Thank you for joining us today. I'm Michaela Blanc, the Curatorial Fellow at MAAM, the Contemporary Art Museum from Massachusetts College of Art and Design. MAAM's inaugural exhibition features a large-scale sculpture called Valkyrie Mumbet from Joana Vasconcelos, who honors Elizabeth Freeman, who was an enslaved woman whose first battle for freedom in 1781 helped to make slavery illegal in Massachusetts. Today we have invited performing artist, storyteller, actor, and playwright Tammy Denease to talk with us about Elizabeth Freeman, whose story is an important part of Massachusetts and the United States history. Mrs. Denease specializes in bringing the stories of hidden women from story like Elizabeth Freeman, and she has been researching and performing about her story for over a decade. Thank you, Tammy, and welcome. It's a
Thank
pleasure.
you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I hope that you can put some context on the life of Elizabeth Freeman, and you could talk about her a little bit so people would know her.
Okay. I'm Elizabeth Mumbet Freeman. She was an enslaved individual who was brought from Claverick, New York to the Berkshires in Massachusetts. Her owner, the Hagaboons, she would be given to his daughter as a wedding gift. And so her story starts from there. She would be taken between the age of 7 and 11. And as far as all of the research I've done, she's never seen her mom after she was given away. She would not see her mom again, but her mom had always instilled in her to remember who she was and to have pride in who she was. And that being a slave, an enslaved individual, did not mean that she was not a human being. And so that always stayed with her. And as she grew into an adult, that stayed with her. And regardless of the fact that she was an enslaved person, she made sure she was respected. And everyone in town did respect her. And she would be the voice for those who couldn't speak, and she would stand for those who couldn't stand for themselves. And through her one act of bravery, she would help to end slavery in Massachusetts. And the beautiful thing about her story is she was not trying to do anything brave, but it's just the fact that she stood up. And after that one act of trying to get her freedom and then eventually getting her freedom, she actually changed the course of history, not only in the state of Massachusetts, but 82 years later, the paperwork and the documentation in the court system for her would be used as the foundation for the Proclamation of Emancipation. So her story is one that definitely needs to be known, and it definitely needs to not be hidden.
Exactly. Yeah, it's just fantastic. And yeah, I think the first question will be, as a historian, when did you decide to work as a performer, especially partnering with cultural institutions? How was it?
Well, it started with me as a young person. I was born and reared in Mississippi. I came to the Northeast as a tween, if you will. And prior to that, I knew my great-grandmother. She was formerly enslaved. She lived to be 125, and my grandmother lived to be 100. And so I spent a lot of time with these women, and I just loved history. And as I'm coming from the South to the North, in the South, as what's the word I want to use, as tumultuous as it can be with the history, we at least knew our history and we knew the truth of the history. But moving to the East Coast, that was not the case. It was the North was always the great hero, the South was the enemy. But in reality, the North was just as complicit in slavery as the South was. And so I wanted to be able to talk about those things that I knew and talk about my heritage, because I knew that up north it was not the truth. And one way to do that was to bring it to life, because the way history has been taught is facts and figures, and you never really see the human side of the people from the past. And me being the imaginative person that I am, and having my great-grandmother and my grandmother in my life, whenever history was being taught, I could always picture the people. I could always picture the things that weren't being said. But I know that for most people, history can be boring because it is facts and figures. And so to be able to bring them to life helps people to appreciate that they were human beings and that they had the same struggles that we have today. May not be in the same context, but they definitely had struggles the way we do today.
Elizabeth Freeman is not the only woman you portrayed. I would like to know, how do you select the woman you portrayed, and who are they actually?
Okay, my selection in women is, there's so many strong women that we don't know a lot about. There go the name Hidden Women. I like to focus on those individuals because society will have you only focus on one or two. The number one is Harriet Tubman, Martin Luther King, Frederick Douglass. Every once in a while, you hear about Sojourner Truth. And again, coming from the South, I knew about all these other people, but up North, they only knew these three people. And it was to say that the Black community could only have one or two people, whereas that wasn't the case. Harriet Tubman did not do it by herself, and she will tell you she did not do it by herself. And so I wanted to choose the women that needed to be talked about, the unsung sheroes, if you will. And so I wanted to tell their stories. And the way that I pick their stories, I do the research and I look for characteristics that I can identify with, because when you're going to bring someone to life, they need to be believable. You need to be able to bring that passion, and you need to make them as real as possible. And the only way that I could do that is to be able to identify with certain characteristics, such as the determination, the resilience, the having a self-love and a self-worth of oneself. And so even though the women that I portray have gone through difficult times, some have actually been enslaved women, they always had that drive and that determination to be other than what society said they should be. The very first woman I portrayed was Bessie Coleman. She's the world's first internationally licensed female pilot, and she was 2 years before Amelia Earhart. Now, the world knows about Amelia, but Bessie is still hidden, if you will. And she has done so much for the world of aviation, not just for the Black community, but on a global scale. But because of racism, Jim Crow laws, and gender discrimination, she ended up having to go to France to learn how to fly. Now, that is definitely taking lemons and making it lemonade, because they wouldn't teach her here in her homeland. But by them being so negative toward her, they actually propelled her into history. She was not trying to be history. She just wanted to fly. And because of that, her story lives on. It's not as widely known as it should be known, but it's getting there. The other person I portray is Sarah Magoo. She is one of the 4 children aboard the Amistad. And most people don't realize that there were 4 children aboard the Amistad, because everyone focuses on the legal case and they focus on John Quincy Adams because he was the white man that helped the slaves. And in reality, they weren't slaves, they were captives. And the Amistad is one of the biggest revolts. With her story, I take you from beginning to end, from where her life was before she was taken captive. She had a family, she had a home, and so I'd like to tell the human side of the Amistad story. Then there's Elizabeth Keckley. She was dressmaker or mantua maker to Mary Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's wife. A mantua maker is like a haute couture person. She specializes in making clothing that other people cannot make. And during the 4 years that Lincoln was in the White House, the clothes that Mary Todd Lincoln wore, the majority of them were made by this woman. She was born into slavery, but she was able to get her and her son's freedom for $1,200. And she borrowed the money and she paid it back, every last penny, to her clients that she borrowed the money from. And then she would go on to build an organization that would help other individuals who were enslaved and that were looking for work and needed a hand up, not a handout. And let's see, who else do I do? Sometimes I forget all the women. Belinda Royal. She is another Massachusetts woman. She was owned by Isaac Royal and his family for 60 years. And at the end of near the end of the Revolutionary War, she was given her freedom by Isaac Royal before he was sort of banished to Nova Scotia, but she had to fight this newfound government to get what was hers. He had left her money, and so that she could take care of her and her family. However, the new government said she was looking for welfare and was looking for a handout, but she was entitled to that money. Her legal document, even though she couldn't read or write, her legal document is on the Tufts website, Tufts University website. She had Phyllis Wheatley and Prince Hall write her legal document. and it talks of her legal struggle. And that her story is the basis of the reparations for descendants of slaves. So that's where the reparation talking point comes from. Then there is Mumbet, of course. Who else? There's one more. Joan Jackson. Joan Jackson. She is my woman from the 1600s, and she lived into the 1730s. She was enslaved, got her freedom, but then was stolen and sold back into slavery. But I like to tell her story because it's a love story where her husband finds out where his wife is, goes and captures her freedom back, brings her back. And for 6 years, he has to fight to get her freedom legally. And that, again, you don't hear about the human side of what, slavery had done to family. They had 9 children, and 3 of them were eventually taken away. But it talks about the horrors of that, but it also talks about the love a man and a woman have for each other. So she's kind of like one of my favorites because you don't hear that too often.
Many people don't know that the community of Stockbridge in Western Massachusetts celebrates the Elizabeth Freeman Day on August 22nd every year. And I would like to understand from you, how do you see the relevance of honoring remarkable dates such as the Mumbet Day and also the Juneteenth? And how can museums and other institutions can accommodate such dates in an appropriate way, I would say, in their programming or in their exhibitions?
I love the fact that they are honoring those who had come before. I think it is important for historical sites and museums to incorporate, because in order to tell the whole story, you need to have both sides. My grandmother used to always say the flattest pancake has 2 sides. So no matter how thin something is, there's always another side to it. And for so long, this country's history has been taught incorrectly. And when you have the victor always telling their side of the story, they're going to always look like the hero. But until you talk to those who have been oppressed, you're not going to have the full story. And again, it is very important to tell those stories. And it's not so much to tell the stories to, when I do a tour that I designed for the museum that I work for here in Connecticut, one of the things I love to say is it's not about shaming, blaming, or guilting. It's simply the facts, because no person living today is responsible for the things that have happened in the past, but people do need to recognize their advantages from certain systems that have been in place since slavery. And I also like to help people to understand, especially the Black community, that slavery is not our history, that slavery interrupted our history. And so that's why it is very important to tell both sides of the story so that people can understand where their roots really lie, or their heritage.
Yeah, and thinking about that, I see that projects like yours can facilitate a conversation between archival practice and also oral history. And knowing that the documentation of Black communities is scarce due to the history of discrimination, can you talk about how's your research process?
Oh, let's see. Research in itself, oh my goodness. It's a fun, frustrating, exhausting, exciting, many adjectives. It could lead you down a rabbit hole, because when you're doing research, especially in the Black community, because a lot of our history was not written down, because one, we weren't allowed to learn this language and to write it, because it was against the law in the southern half of the states, but in the northern part, enslaved people could learn to read because they were expected to go to church. But the downside to that is they also like to use the slave Bible. And basically that was the Holy Bible that they would remove certain passages out to make it the captives or those who were born into slavery think that they were supposed to be subservient and treated in such a manner, instead of seeing the whole Bible where it says, no, even if you were a slave, you're still entitled to your dignity and humanity. And so that was a two-edged sword when you were able to learn how to read, because then you still weren't being given all that you needed. And so our history wasn't always necessarily written down, so we had to rely on oral to learn about our traditions, to learn about our heritage, because once a person was captive and brought to the foreign land, they were, their actual heritage was beaten out of them, if you will. Their cultural inheritance was beaten or taken away from them. They weren't allowed, because when the Africans were brought here to Connecticut, they brought the love of their music and their dance and their telling of their stories, but then suddenly those things were taken away. They weren't allowed to have those things. Suddenly they couldn't have their drum ceremonies. They couldn't gather together, even today. And that's an effect from the oppressors' systems put into place. Because even today in the Black community, we gather, we're a big family. But with the policing, it's like, oh, if you see too many of us together, oh, there must be an issue, there must be a problem. And no, there isn't. That's how we do. And it's the same thing in corporate, where there's only a few people of color in the workplace. They still have to be careful, because if they're together too much or too often, that goes against them, and that could actually jeopardize their livelihood. So those things are still in play today. And so that's why it is so important to know your heritage. It is so important to know the whole story and understand what these systems are about. With the protests and everything that's going on today, if people really knew what it was all about, it's really not about race. It's really not about the color of your skin, because racism, or the construct of race, is a societal design for division. And it's really not about the color of your skin. It's about power. And it goes into the few who have the power that don't want the masses to know about it. And for instance, with police brutality, that stems back from slavery as well. The first police department, if you will, was actually about slave catchers. They were given the authority to chase after individuals who have run away from the horrible conditions. They even had badges that said slave catcher on it. And so even though today the badge has their ID number, but back then it actually said slave catcher. And they were patty rollers, where they were given this authority to chase after the individual, and they were treated as if they were less than animals. And you were given the authority to do whatever you needed to do to bring them back. And that has carried down through the generations. And it is thought that the Black person was animalistic, was to be feared. And in reality, no. If you're hurting a person, you're going to get a reaction, you know? And if you're treating a person less than, at some point, they're going to revolt. They're going to attack, because there's only so much anyone can take. And unfortunately, the Black community, especially Black women, we are not treated well. We are at the very bottom. And even though everyone is talking about everything that's happening to the Black men, and that's not to be minimized by any say so whatsoever, or if not so, more so mistreated and killed, but you don't see as much publicity, you don't see as much outcry. And that goes to gender discrimination, that goes to colorism. And so there's these different systems that are put into place to oppress people. And now it has gotten to that point where the pot is boiling over and things need to be done and changes need to be made.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for this message. I think you presented stories to young and adult audiences in many museums, schools, different geographical locations. And what do you define as I would say, the best audience from what you do?
Actually, I would have to say they're both audiences are really, I appreciate both audiences, because the younger audience, they get the same story, but it's on their level. I refuse to water down history. I don't care which audience I am. However, when I'm teaching with my children, I don't horrify them in such a way that they're having nightmares, but they understand that, oh, that could have easily have been me, and how would I have responded. Now with my adult audience, oh, they get it in 3D. They get everything. Now, the interesting thing about that is children are, I would say the adults have a harder time, because at this point in their life, what they have learned, even though it's incorrect, it shatters their perception of what they thought life was. I've given tours to seniors, and here in Connecticut, most people in Connecticut, let alone the country, realized that Connecticut was a slave state. And I gave a senior tour once, and she was almost 80 years old, and she could not believe what she was hearing. She was like, I have been here all of my life. I have grown up here. I went to school here. I married my family. That's not possible. And by the end of the tour, she was in tears, because she's like, my whole life has been a lie, because that's not what I learned. I didn't know this. And she's like, I have literally lived here all my life, and I'm almost 80 years old. So it's interesting to see when the light bulb goes off with the adults, where it's like, wait, what? That can't be. And that's a shock to the system, because you know your whole life you're thinking one way, and now all of a sudden this stranger appears to you, and so it is a shock. And again, it rolls down to current events today, because you have people who they live comfortable lives, and they're thinking the rest of the world must be comfortable too. Yeah. And then when they get outside of their bubble and they get outside of their comfortability, it's like, oh wait, it's not as comfortable as I thought. And so then you get a little pushback, because now they got to become uncomfortable, and no one wants to be uncomfortable. But again, it's a conversation that needs to be had, and you got to get uncomfortable. You got to get comfortable with being uncomfortable at this point, because there's a tipping point now, and it's boiling over.
Thinking about what you just mentioned, knowing that cultural institutions have a huge impact on shaping the collective memory and bringing awareness. I think projects like yours can bring awareness to underrepresentation within the museum field, not only in the collections, but also in the museum staff as well. So how do you, from your, I think from your perspective, what do you think, what are the ethos institutions should make to discuss social justice, as giving the example of this lady, of 80-year-old lady?
I think that the institution, especially those that have put themselves in place to be charges of history, they need to do an accurate representation. The museum that I am at, I've been there for almost 17 years, and I've been the only person of color in the museum. And oftentimes I speak to that, the loneliness of it, the frustration of it, because sometimes when I'm speaking of certain issues, it goes through one ear and out the other, or I sound like I'm making too big of a deal out of something, when in reality, no, you need to understand. And it was kind of frustrating, because I've been doing what I do for years now, and it's sort of twofold, because while I'm doing this, like I want everyone to get the message, I need them to, and now that the protesting is going on, suddenly everyone is woke, and it's like, wait, why did it have to take the death of someone for you to be woke? And it was the same thing with where I work. And I mean, it's a great museum. I love it, the history, it's a magical place, but it needs to have the representation of those who helped to build those homes, because it's a 3-home museum. And they're making the steps, they're doing the progress. We have a new director coming in, and so they're making forward steps now to do such a thing. But it's difficult when I travel to different places, because I don't see people that look like me. Every once in a while, I'll see someone who looks like me. And even then, they're not really in a position to do anything or to make decisions. It's sort of like in a token role. And that's how I sometimes feel. I feel like I'm sometimes in a token role. And it gets frustrating. It really does, because I feel like my voice is not heard. And finally, I was given a grant to do further research to bring the enslaved story to life, because you can't continue to talk about George Washington and the founding fathers without telling how they got to where they are. Because if it was not for the Africans and the Native Americans that they eventually let be a part of the Continental Army, Washington would not have won the Revolutionary War. And so those stories need to be told. You don't hear these stories. You don't realize that there are Black and Native Revolutionary War vets. You don't hear stories. You don't know these stories. And so and get beyond the tokenism of it and say, oh, we'll have a person here. But yeah, you'll have that person of color maybe as your receptionist, but do they get to do more meaningful things? Do they get to be a part of those decision makings? Because a lot of times when organizations, corporations, museums, whatever, they make some big blunders because you didn't have the right representation on your staff making these decisions. And now you have to apologize, or now you have to do PR control, because damage control, because you've offended a whole lot of people because you haven't had the right representation. So oftentimes when I travel and I do my shows, go to these organizations, I do ask the question, and they're like, well, I want to tell the story of this. Okay, do you have any people of color on staff? And the question marks are literally over the top of their head, like, oh, that never occurred to us. What do you mean that never occurred to you? How could that not occur to you? You want to tell these stories. Why do you want to tell these stories? Because you really want to tell the stories, or do you want to look politically correct? And so like I was saying before, I've actually lost opportunities at work because I refuse to water it down. I refuse to not help you to see what is standing in front of you. And it's okay. I have no problem with losing that work because I'm not going to water it down. I'm not going to cater to your fragility to make you feel good about not doing what needs to be done. So I'm sure I've lost several opportunities to work with organizations, and I'm okay with that because that's not why I'm here.
They don't deserve you.
Oh, thank you.
It's a great message. Yeah, I think we can go to the final comment. And
okay.
Understanding that the Massachusetts College of Art and Design, it's a school for artists in the big spectrum of artists. I would like you, if you could leave a message to young generations of storytellers, what would you say?
One of the things I would say to different artists, the ones that actually paint, historically speaking, there's only a few, and actually there's only one picture of a former enslaved individual, Ayuba Solomon, and I hope I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, where he looks like a human being. Normally, when you see historical paintings of an enslaved person, they're depicted as animalistic. They have bugged out eyes and beaked nose. They have animalistic features. They're not even presented as human beings. So I would say, please, let's correct that vein of painting and let's depict people as they really are. Show their true character. Show their true features. If they have the kinky, naughty, nappy hair, show that because it's beautiful. If they have the darker hue, show that, but do it accurately. Do not over exaggerate it where it looks like they're in blackface or painted with tar. Those are insults, and those are pictures that are out there from the past. As oral storytellers, I would say make sure you're telling it the way it needs to be told. Make sure you're telling the facts. It's okay to make it lively, but tell the facts. Make sure the whole side is told, and there's no way you're going to be able to depict my passion and my frustration and so forth with the way I've been treated in life, but you can speak to it from a side of empathy of how it would have made you feel if you would, because as a Black person in this society, it's very something you have no could look down upon. And so I would speak to oral storytellers and tell the story how it really is. Tell it the way it should be told, and don't water it down. Don't water it down. Tell it the way it needs to be told. If you're speaking to children, do it on a level that they understand, but you still do not water it down. And don't be afraid. Do not be afraid. You may lose some, but in the end, the truth is out there, and that is much more important, and you'll be able to look yourself in the mirror and say, hey, I did what was right.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Tammy. It was a pleasure talking to you. And yeah, I hope museums will get the message. That's my hope.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it's the tide is turning. I think it is, with all that's going on in today's climate, I think the message is finally received. And I think that, at least I hope so, that we will start to see the whole story being told. The whole story, not just the victor story. So we shall see.
We shall see, yeah. Okay, thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you, Michaela. I appreciate talking to you. It was great to meet you.
It was great to meet you too.